In any large city, there are people who stop being people. Not all at once, but gradually. First, they lose their names to everyone around them. Then, they lose their stories. Then they become part of the scenery, like lampposts or puddles, like something that's just there, something nobody chose and nobody quite knows what to do with. It isn't always cruelty that causes this. Sometimes it's exhaustion. Sometimes it's fear. Sometimes it's simply that the city is vast, life moves fast, and someone else's pain takes up a kind of space that's hard to keep holding. But there are people who stop, who look, who decide that the scenery cannot keep being scenery. Agnes Gongsha-Boyakshiu was one of them. The world would come to know her by a different name. She was born in Skopje in 1910, into an Albanian family with deep Catholic roots. Her father was a merchant. Her mother was a woman of practical faith, the kind who didn't separate prayer from bread or devotion from action. When Agnes was 8 years old, her father died. The exact circumstances were never entirely clear, but the loss was sudden, and it reshaped that family permanently. Her mother raised the children through a combination of work, strength, and religious conviction. It wasn't a house of speeches. It was a house where faith showed up in what you did with your hands. Agnes grew up in that atmosphere, and from a young age, she knew she wanted to be a missionary. That kind of calling doesn't come from nowhere. She had read about missions in India, heard letters from priests working there, felt something in those stories pulling at her. At 18, she made a decision that doesn't come with an easy way back. She left her home, her city, her language, her mother, and her sister to enter the Sisters of Loreto, an Irish congregation with missions in Asia. She would never see her mother again. That detail seems small. It isn't. Leaving at 18 for a convent, knowing you likely won't return, is a kind of small death before a different life begins. She arrived in India in 1929. She learned Bengali, learned Hindi, adjusted to the heat, to the density of Calcutta, to the scale of a poverty that had no visible equivalent in Europe. But for nearly 2 decades, her life followed a relatively ordered path. She taught at St. Mary's School in Calcutta, a school for girls, many from families with means. In time, she became its principal. She was respected, capable, disciplined. She was not a woman who went unnoticed. But the streets of Calcutta were right outside, and the poverty there was not an abstract backdrop. It was concrete, visible, impossible to fully ignore. In 1946, during a train ride to Darjeeling for her annual spiritual retreat, Teresa experienced what she herself described as a call within a call. It was not a dramatic vision or an extraordinary phenomenon in any conventional sense. It was something interior, deep, and persistent. A conviction that would not fade. Leave the safety of the convent. Go out into the streets. Live among the poorest of the poor. Not just help them from a distance, but be with them. The difference between helping from a distance and actually being present is not just geographical. It is the difference between giving something and giving yourself. But a decision like that does not get carried out overnight. There were permissions to request, responses to wait for, a process of discernment that took time and was not free of uncertainty. This was not an impulsive woman abandoning everything on a passing feeling. Teresa was meticulous, persistent, capable of holding a conviction without dramatizing it. In 1948, she received authorization to leave the Loreto convent. She exchanged the congregation's habit for a white sari with blue borders. She went to study basic nursing with the medical mission sisters in Patna. And then she returned to Calcutta, this time without the convent walls as a frame. The first months were hard in ways that rarely get told honestly. She was alone, had no resources, no structure, no guarantees. She lived among sick and abandoned people, tending wounds, bathing bodies, sitting with those who had no one else. Years later, she wrote about that period as one of the most difficult of her life. Not because the mission felt wrong, but because the scale of need was so immense that any individual response seemed almost absurd by comparison. And yet, she continued. In 1950, she founded the Missionaries of Charity, a new congregation, built differently, designed to live and work among the poorest, not from nearby, but from within. Not to be close to the poor, but to be poor among them. That distinction matters. The white sari with blue borders became a recognizable symbol around the world. In 1952, she opened Nirmal Hriday, which means pure heart in Bengali, a home for dying people who were ending their lives on the streets of Calcutta, with no care, no dignity, no one to hold their hand at the end. The idea was simple and radical at the same time, that at least in that final hour, no one would be alone. The work grew. Over the years, the Missionaries of Charity expanded to dozens of countries. Teresa received recognition, met with heads of state, and was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1979. When she traveled to Oslo to accept it, she did not speak about politics or systems. She spoke about the poor by name, about the forgotten with bodies. She asked that the Nobel banquet be cancelled and that the money go to the poor in India. That was not a public relations gesture. It was consistency. But there is a part of Teresa of Calcutta's story that remained hidden for a long time. And when it came to light, it changed the way people understood her. For decades, while she was building her congregation, caring for the dying, receiving awards, and speaking before the world, Teresa was moving through a profound spiritual darkness. Not a passing doubt, not a crisis that lasted a few weeks. Years and years in which, according to her own words in letters never meant to be published, she felt nothing of God's presence. Nothing. An interior silence she described as darkness, as absence, as a void that would not lift. It would be easy to read that as contradiction. A woman who spoke of finding Christ in the poor, who founded a congregation in the name of that faith, who was received by crowds who considered her a saint and who at the same time felt none of what she described. But to read it that way is to misunderstand what faith actually looks like when it is truly tested. Teresa's faith was not the result of a steady mystical experience. It was a sustained decision made in the face of silence. It meant getting up anyway. It meant washing the body of a dying stranger without feeling any inner consolation, without receiving anything in return, without the sense that anyone was watching. It was fidelity without emotional reward. And in spiritual terms, that is not less faith. It is more. She died in Calcutta on September 5, 1997, just weeks after the death of Princess Diana, which consumed the world's attention. Pope Francis canonized her in 2016, recognizing not only her outward work, but the depth of an interior life that was neither easy nor comfortable. The Church acknowledged, through that process, the miracles attributed to her intercession, the testimonies of those who knew her, and the coherence between what she believed and how she lived. But the question her life leaves behind is not primarily religious. It is human. What do we do with the people a city learns not to see? What happens when someone decides to stop and look directly at what everyone else learned to walk around? Teresa of Calcutta did not solve poverty in Calcutta. She never claimed she could. What she did was smaller and harder. She stayed present. She touched. She called by name those who had no name for anyone else. She reminded the world, through her body, and not through speeches, that a person's dignity does not depend on their health, their wealth, or whether anyone remembers them. There is an image that works better than any summary. A small woman, barely 5 feet tall, in a white sari with blue borders, walking into a narrow street in Calcutta. Not with certainty that everything will be fine. Not with the feeling of God in every step. With a decision made years ago and renewed every morning. That as long as she is there, at least that person will not be alone. That is not a small thing. In many ways, it is everything.